Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Frank Berry. Frank is a member of the Bloomberg editorial board and a columnist there, and the author of a really cool new book, which I just finished. I'll hold it up for everyone, called Back Roads and Better Angels, which is kind of it's hard to pin it down, but it's part travelogue, part history, part cultural examination of what's going on in this country. So, Frank, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to having this conversation because you and I have been thinking about the same things in some detail for quite some time. And I had the pleasure of reading the new book and just looking forward to picking your brain. We're in this incredible moment in time where the political scene has sort of ramped up its voice even louder than before in a crazy twist of fate. So the book is very timely, and I'm just happy to have you here.
Well, thanks. Yeah, the book, as we'll talk about, is set in 2020, but as it turns out, 2024 looks a lot like 2020. So much of what I explore in the book, the themes and the topics,
Yep.
are kind of crazily newsy and relevant at the moment.
They're super relevant. So yeah, why don't we start with this? Why don't you briefly describe sort of how the book came to be and what it is, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So in 2016, I was looking for a different way into the story that everybody was talking about, which was, of course, what was happening in the country and where the divisions that we were seeing were coming from, why the country was so divided. And I stumbled across this thing called the Lincoln Highway, which I think I had heard of, but had completely forgotten about. Most people have never heard of it, but it was the first transcontinental route to connect the two coasts. It runs from New York City to San Francisco. It was dedicated in 1913 at the dawn of the auto age. And I began thinking, oh, well, what if I went out on the Lincoln Highway and talked with people about, instead of what's dividing the country, we're reading about that in the newspaper every day, what holds the country together? And it didn't happen in 2016. Work got in the way. But when the pandemic came around and my wife and I found each other staring at each other in lockdown, we thought, as crazy as it may seem, this is probably our now or never moment for taking the time to drive across the country and go exploring these questions.
Very cool. And so you bought the Winnebago, which you must have bought it before the prices went crazy, right? Like, because there was a moment. Yeah.
We got lucky. We got lucky. We didn't want to be staying at a different hotel every night in the middle of the pandemic, and so we thought, "What? How else can we do this?" Well, we could camp, but it's going to get cold, and camping and setting up a tent every night is going to be a bit much. And so we said, "Let's look into the RV market." Neither of us knew anything about RVs. We had never driven an RV, but that seemed like maybe the way to do it. And a lot of other people had the idea of getting out of town in an RV. But the market hadn't gone crazy yet, so we got lucky. Just it so happened went looking on RVTrader.com and found a 2017 Winnebago with 30,000 miles on it, 25 feet, had a kitchen, a bath, and a bed. We decided that it was the biggest RV we wanted to drive and the smallest RV we wanted to live in. And so we got lucky, and because I was the first inquiry, it just so happened the ad had just posted. The woman kindly said, "Okay, well, it's yours if you want it, but you got to tell me now because we got a bunch of other people waiting in line behind you to buy it." And so very quickly, my wife and I had to decide whether we wanted to make our first real vehicle purchase, because we're New York City people. We don't own a car. We take the subway every day. But we made the leap and bought this RV.
Yeah, that's like the most unusual first car for anybody in America, unless you're first, definitely for a New Yorker. Usually get something smaller. So, what is the rough geography of the Lincoln Highway? Like, you start in New York, right? And then where do you go through roughly?
So it takes a northern route across the country, and if you've driven Route 80 all the way across the country, you're probably familiar with that route. You may even have been on the Lincoln Highway for a little bit of it. And the reason that Route 80 goes the way that it does is because it tracked the Lincoln Highway. And the reason the Lincoln Highway goes the way it does is because it tracked the railroad. And so when the Lincoln Highway creators established the route, they were looking for the shortest way across the country, the most efficient way to get from New York to California. And that's still what Route 80 really is, the fastest way to get from one coast to the other. But when you do it on the Lincoln Highway, it's definitely not the fastest way to get across the country, because you're going through all of these small towns and you're zigzagging through all of these, right, left-hand turns. But it gives you a whole different perspective on the country than doing it on the highways.
Yeah, as I was reading the book, I was reminiscing on my own trips. I've done 2 cross country drives with my dad, actually. One's when I went to law school. We drove from Detroit to Palo Alto and we took Route 80.
Okay.
And then we did another one years later when I was just like moving one car to Southern California. We did the southern route. So we
Uh-huh.
sort of made our way south and then took the 10. And so we've
Uh-huh.
done both, but it's very different than the Lincoln Highway. The Lincoln Highway is not really a highway, right? It's kind of like a bunch of roads got clogged together. And there's this famous story which you referenced in the book about how in the maybe pre-World War One days, Eisenhower was on that road and realized the potential, the problems of not having highways and the potential of what they could be. So tell that story briefly.
Yeah, so Lincoln Highway dedicated in 1913, but as you say, it wasn't a highway. Not only was it not a highway, it wasn't even a road. The founders of it just basically pulled out a map, drew lines between towns, and said, presto, there's your Lincoln Highway, and challenged communities to go build it. Most of them didn't. Very little road got built in those early years. And so in 1919, at the end of the First World War, the Army realized during the war they had a problem. They couldn't get tanks and other heavy vehicles across the country. And so they decided to run an experiment, which was to take this big convoy across the country as a way to essentially test out what it would take to move a big military convoy across the country in the case of an invasion. And Eisenhower, as it happens, was on that convoy. It took them 2 months to get across the country. They took the Lincoln Highway. And as the report makes clear from that trip, they were basically pushing their vehicles through mud half the time and trying to construct roads as they went. The report says that the Lincoln Highway exists more in the imagination than in reality. And later on, Eisenhower would credit that experience with helping to inspire his vision of the interstate highway system.
Yeah, very cool. Well, one of the things that struck me as I was reading the book is the extent to which American history has this legacy of violence. You do a great job of discussing these. I mean, really, the Lincoln Highway, in many ways, when you read the book, you realize is a geographical route that is covered with violent incidents, whether against the natives or against immigrants or blacks or whatever. There's violence along the whole route. And I feel like America hasn't really quite reckoned with all that. What's your take after kind of going through these places where these incidents occurred and writing about them and thinking about them? What's your take?
Yeah, so it's interesting you use the word reckoning there because we were traveling in 2020 and reckoning was a word on a lot of people's lips in the wake of the George Floyd murder. A lot of discussion about reckoning on race. And that was part of the inspiration for the trip, to reckon with some of our history on race and beyond. And to do that by digging into the roadside that we passed. And so you're right, there's violence that stretches all along the Lincoln Highway, but there's violence that stretches along any route that you're going to take to get from one coast to the other. It's part of our history, it's part of who we are, and it's part of the struggle to shape the country, to expand the circle of freedom, the challenges that groups have faced to be accepted. Really line the Lincoln Highway, and they're still going on today. And so, for instance, a quick story: as we were setting off on the very first day, I met Mayor Sadaf Jaffer, who was mayor of Montgomery Township, New Jersey, and she was the first Muslim woman elected mayor in America. And she talked about the effect of Islamophobia on her and her campaign, and the pain that it presented, and the errors, the kind of the vicious errors that people were spewing about Islam. And I heard something similar from the imam of the first mosque built in America in Iowa, who talked about the rise of Islamophobia, particularly in the Trump era. And both had credited President Bush with saying post 9/11 that Islam is a Muslim of peace, and what that meant to those communities and to their acceptance. But I bring this up partly because in between there, I stopped. Lincoln Highway runs through South Bend, Indiana, and I stopped and spoke with the president of the University of Notre Dame, Father John Jenkins. And he talked about the Catholic struggle for acceptance, and how long and difficult that was, beginning really in the earliest days of the Republic, stretching through the Civil War, stretching through the 1920s. And so in the 1920s, you have the rise of the KKK, and there is an incident in South Bend that I recount in the book about the KKK marching through town and being confronted by Catholic students at Notre Dame, which is exactly what the KKK wanted. It was the reason why they chose Notre Dame or South Bend to have the march. They wanted to provoke the students. But that history and explore in the book about what Catholics did to win acceptance and to overcome that bigotry and that fear of the other and a fear of a different religion, the fear of the belief that Catholics and the Pope were attempting to take over the country. And that struggle for acceptance runs through all of American history. And we see it today with Muslims and in other areas too. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from refreshing our memory, from learning about some of this history that is buried in the roadside. Some of it because it was so painful to talk about that generations didn't want to, and they didn't pass those stories down to the next generation. And other times because, of course, in most cases, the victors write the history, and those stories just get left out of our tale. But I think we're a stronger country when we can face them and learn from them, because, of course, as the old saying goes, you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I got this sense from reading the book that America, has obviously been wrestling with an evolving national identity, and you write about that eloquently in the book. And one of the questions I've been really wanting to ask you is, I haven't really studied, I'm an American, and I haven't really studied other countries, but I get this feeling that process of reckoning and re-examining and coming to terms with a truth that may be different than the mythology that we got taught in school, for example, 40 years ago. But do you think that's unique to America? Like the ability to re-examine these core myths about who we are and what makes us who we are, and actually confront the truth and then construct a new myth? Or do you think other countries are doing that too?
I think that there is a part of American exceptionalism there, the constant struggle to define identity. I do think that's part of what it means to be an American, because it is so much a part of our history from the very get-go. The promise that all men are created equal is something that meant something very different in 1776 than it would 100 years later, and that it does today. And I think other countries also wrestle with these questions, but I think America, uniquely has these questions at the center of our existence, because we're not a country that is based on a particular ethnicity or a language. We're based on ideas, on ideals, and the argument over those ideals has been happening since day one and before. And it's healthy, right? That's a good thing. We need that argument, but we need to be able to conduct that argument civilly and respectfully, with respect for law, And as long as we can do that, the struggle for answers, we don't always get them right, but it has worked. All right, it's kind of this long journey of progress, not inevitable and not always linear, but progress. And that's mostly because there has been a willingness to accept that the struggle requires accepting answers, and living to fight another day. And as long as we can do that, then the country as we know it can exist. But when a group decides that they are no longer willing to accept the answer, then you've got a problem. That's how we get the Civil War. When the southern states decided, no, we're not going to accept the results of this election, of the election of Lincoln, and what it would mean, and we're going to break away, and that breakdown in faith leads to the near split of the country.
Yeah. That's another thing that comes up a lot in the book, actually, is the Civil War, which I found fascinating because at that moment in time, there was a lot of discussion around, the monuments that were all over the country, not just in the South, but maybe mostly in the South. And I feel like that is another area of American history that is not quite done, actually. I think that was such a trauma for this country, and so many people died, and Lincoln was assassinated, and that kind of set everything back. And we're still actually dealing with that. And I think it comes out in the book, in the people you talk to.
Yeah, very much so. I couldn't agree more. We're still reckoning with the legacy of the Civil War, and you see it in the arguments over the monuments, and the monuments are just a stand-in for beliefs. And I think it's very easy to have these arguments over the monuments in the abstract, but what we did in traveling through the South, which eventually we did after the Lincoln Highway ended, we came back on a southern route like you did, was we read what was on the monuments. Instead of just saying I'm pro or against this Confederate monument, what does it say? And what we found, so many of them said, was a version of glorification. It wasn't just a tribute to a fallen soldier. It was a glorification of the cause for which they fought, and sometimes white supremacy was inscribed into the stone, in the words that mark the monument. And that's something that is really important, I think, to the debate, because, of course, it shapes public memory, shapes present sense of identity. And I don't think you can have a discussion about Confederate monuments without understanding, of course, both why they were erected, which wasn't just to honor a fallen soldier, but also the words on them, and what that message, whether it's set up in a town square or in front of a courthouse, what that message today sends. And so that's some of the kind of forgotten history that I try to bring into the story as we go along.
Yeah, which I think is really important and it's fascinating. I read a couple of years ago, I like dedicated quite some time, and I read that gigantic Shelby Foote 3-volume Civil War series, which actually is incredible writing. It sort of reads like a screenplay. Like his descriptions of the battles are like movie-esque, and it's well worth the investment, especially if you have any interest. But one of the takeaways I had from that book is that if you trust his sources and his analysis of it, it's interesting to understand sort of the perspective of like the Northern generals, like Sherman and Grant, and what they viewed the Southern generals as. Like they were just traitors.
Yeah,
that's the view they had. And
yeah,
when the war was over, like some of the more aggressive commanders were like, let's just kill everybody. And then Lincoln obviously was on the path of like, hey, let's reconcile and let's bring this country together. But we obviously lost that sentiment in the aftermath of the assassination of Lincoln and the end of sort of really the Reconstruction era. Obviously, these people came to be heroes. But in that moment, if you polled America, like they were traitors.
Yeah, absolutely. And that wasn't just the generals in the North. It was true of public sentiment. It was true of rank and file, and so much so that for a generation after the war, there was very, very deep opposition to any public monumentation on battlefields or elsewhere that would mark the Confederate cause, because there was a concern that what would happen was the two causes, North and South, would come to be considered equals. That here was this, fight between equals, and, at the end of the day, one side won, but they were both, and that was what happened. That's what came to pass in many ways. That the Civil War came to be viewed as this fight between Confederates and Union soldiers, and it was a fight to preserve America that Americans in the South started with the bombardment of Fort Sumter. But the attempt to change that story was still written in some of the signs that we saw and some of the monuments that we saw. So the idea, the claim that Lincoln invaded the South, that word invasion was very present in a lot of the signage that we saw. And why invasion? Because if it's an invasion, all you're doing is defending yourself. And then it becomes a justified and just war. And so the attempt to rewrite history begins almost as soon as the war ends. And the Northern generals and the Northern public understood that monuments would be one way the South would try to do that. And that's why they opposed them so strongly.
Yeah. So fascinating. We could talk about the Civil War. We should do another episode all about the Civil War. But I want to get into your book because it's more important at this point. But one of the other points that you cover very well is the extent to which Abraham Lincoln represents sort of a true American ideal as president. And in this particular case is a perfect sort of anecdote for why he was right, which is there was a general who fought with Lee at Gettysburg, and he fought in the Wilderness Campaign. He was like a legit Confederate general named Longstreet, who you write about in the book, had an incredible transformation after the war. And I walked away just like really inspired from that story. I didn't realize that he had turned so much. But tell me a little bit about, or tell us all a little bit about that story.
Yeah, well, Longstreet, after he was one of the most important Confederate generals, and after the war, though, unlike most others, became an advocate for reunification and for all that, in his view, required. And so he became a Republican, and so he didn't have to become a Republican to support reunification, but he supported. He became no longer an apologist for the Confederate cause, but a champion of reunification and what that would require, including in terms of acceptance of blacks as citizens. And as a result of that, he was essentially written out of Confederate lore, and so there are no. You see, the South erects all of these statues to Confederate generals, none to Longstreet. Longstreet ends up getting blamed for the loss at Gettysburg, even though it was Lee who ordered the Pickett's charge, and otherwise, I think most historians would agree, deserves the lion's share of the blame for what happened at Gettysburg, not Longstreet. But Longstreet becomes the villain. Not because of what happened in the war, but because of his politics afterwards. And Longstreet, turns out, is not alone. And there were other Southerners, many of them who sided with the North, never abandoned their commission, stayed in the Union Army, fought valiantly and heroically in the war, and were never lionized in the South, never given any statues in the South. They were Southerners too, but they were written out of the story. And that's something that I think when people say, oh, well, the South, believed this and the South wanted that, it's very important, I think, to distinguish. Well, not everybody. And who's not everybody? Well, a lot of the Southern officers did not join the Confederacy. A lot of the Southern poor did not want the war. And of course, a lot of the Southern population supported the North. Who's that population? Black citizens, who made up the majority of the population. This is often forgotten. Enslaved people tend to be thought of as a minority. But in a variety of states, they were either the majority or very close to it. And so the idea of Southern opinion being this monolith is just factually wrong.
Yep, that's right. As I was reading the book, I was thinking a lot about this in the context of this moment. And actually, in the time in which you and I met and I read the book, we've had some crazy happenings. We've had an attempted assassination for Donald Trump, and Biden dropping out. And I think what these stories and what you capture so well in the book is that they demonstrate what Lincoln's life sort of demonstrates. And this is why Lincoln, in my view, is the best president, is that there's always the possibility for growth. That's what America is. We grow, and the potential is there to grow morally. And that is true of individuals. So you might look at a Longstreet or a George Wallace, which you talk about in the book as well, or even a Donald Trump. You look at a Donald Trump in 2016. Well, he, like everyone else, he can become a better person. And I feel like we've forgotten that at this moment in time. Everyone has sort of got a fixed identity, and if they've done something, we should cancel them and never listen to them again. But what Lincoln was trying to tell everyone is like, hey, even if someone is your mortal enemy, you got to give them a chance to grow and change and come to the correct opinion or correct view of what the truth is. And
Yeah, I'd agree that one of Lincoln's greatest qualities as a leader was his humility and empathy, and his unwillingness to judge. And so he said of Southerners in the 1850s, they are just as we would be if we were in their situation. And I think it's very difficult to say that at any time. He said it about a practice that he abhorred. He believed slavery to be a moral abomination. And yet he was still able to recognize that had he been born into different circumstances, he might very well have different views about it. And I think that is a truth, that we are all shaped by our circumstances, and a little bit of humility and grace in recognizing that can go a long way. And since you mentioned this about Lincoln, I think it's also important to note that you mentioned this idea of kind of damning people for not believing something, a particular thing, and Lincoln would fail any purity test. He was not an abolitionist, even though he believed slavery to be a moral abomination. Because what was he interested in doing? Not in proving that he was right, but in winning election. And he understood that to win an election, you cannot be too far ahead of the people. You have to be able to earn their trust, to bring them along and push them forward and lead them forward. But you can't be too far out ahead of them either. And so the genius, I think, part of Lincoln's genius was always trying to push the ideas of American freedom forward, but while doing it in a way that would that never lost sight of what it took to hold the country together, and to promote a sense of unity.
yeah, that's right. And I always am just fascinated by the fact that, like, if you just take a step back and look at, like, I listened to a bunch of these Civil War songs. I got into them for a while, and they're really inspiring. They're religious themed, but they talk directly about this issue of slavery. I mean, many of them do. Some of them are just about the Union. But what to me is so fascinating is that Lincoln and his contemporaries, they managed to convince a population that was probably largely racist to engage in, like, ideological warfare to the death. Uh, Really about something that maybe if you had polled them 10 years ago, they could care less about.
Yeah.
Somehow they got them to go and stand in a row and kill each other for something that, it was just maybe a remote thought in their brain 10 years old. It's a phenomenal achievement, and it shows you what America can do, really, in my view.
Yeah. He convinced people, and not just him, but other Northern leaders, that the country was worth fighting for. It was not initially a war to liberate the slaves, and couldn't have been in order to garner public support. But as the war went on, it's easy to forget now too, but public anger at what the South was doing to the country, of course, increased as so many casualties piled up. And so Lincoln recognized there was a political gain to be had in the Emancipation Proclamation, as well as military gain in eventually enlisting black soldiers in the fight. but yeah, and part of how Lincoln did exactly what you're saying is through words and inspiration and appealing to these ideas of what America is and why it's worth preserving. And the beauty of those words we're still talking about today and still taking inspiration from.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a large part of your book, which I want to get to now, is kind of a testament to just that because, as you mentioned earlier, the intent of the book wasn't to drive around America and find out like, hey, why is this place so messed up? Why are people hating on each other? It was the opposite, which I think is really cool. And what you found is there's a bunch of stuff, and they're all like really important things to consider. People like flippantly talk on Twitter about civil war, but this country's far from civil war. There's a unity here, and there's a what you found in your book, from what I could tell, like there's a dislike for the disunity that is appearing in these online forums. Like Americans don't really vibe with that when you meet them in person, which I think is fascinating. But before we get into the stuff that holds together, I just was curious, when you set off on the journey, did you have a hypothesis about what the problems of America were? I know that wasn't the focus of the book, but you must have thought about like, hey, why is this country presenting in this way? I just want to know what you were thinking at that moment.
Well, I didn't have a hypothesis on what I would hear from people. Um, I mostly went to listen and wanted to talk with people from all different walks of life about what they were thinking and feeling about how national issues were affecting their own circumstances and their own local communities. So I don't think I had a kind of overreaching hypothesis in terms of the state of the country, other than really, at a time of all this division, a time of COVID, a time of George Floyd aftermath, of just wanted to dig into it all.
I see. But did you think, like, as someone who works in the journalism business, did you think like anything that the division that we're seeing in the political like vitriol was a function of the social media stuff? Did you have any thoughts about that going into this?
Well, yeah, I certainly did have a feeling that social media was contributing to the problem, while also I think recognizing that social media is often a very, very bad reflection of real life, and it's not really how people think and feel. But it's so in our face that we tend to overstate its reality. Um, so I didn't want to put too much stock in that. But I also had a feeling that, just having read history, that we'd been through versions of this before, and wanting to try to draw connections to and lessons from that history to help kind of guide us across the landscape. And so that was part of, I suppose, to the extent there was a hypothesis, that there was some comfort that I hoped we might take in knowing that some versions of what we're experiencing have played out in the past. And of course, Lincoln and the Civil War were kind of the ultimate examples of that. And that's why they were such perfect guides.
Yeah. And also, I guess too, the McCarthy era, like that was a moment
Absolutely.
in time where you could sort of that version of getting canceled was to be labeled as a communist and investigated, which the Oppenheimer movie that Christopher Nolan did a really good job of kind of showing what that might look like, which looks pretty terrifying actually.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the book, I explore a little bit about how that is reverberating and echoing today, because and it's less on the right in terms of communism, although there's certainly versions of it. We see it in book bans and such that exist that are being attempted on the right. But I wanted to challenge both parties in the book to kind of look within for where threats to democracy can come from. And certainly censorship on the left, takes its own forms, and certainly did not shy away from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you were going across the country, how many people did you end up talking to?
A good question. I ought to go back and count them up, but I don't know. It was dozens, certainly.
It felt like more than that. It felt like you had to have gotten into the 100, at least 100
Yeah,
people. Yeah.
it probably was. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, people would, I joke at the beginning of the book, everyone asked us when we told them we were driving cross country, they all said, "Are you going to Yellowstone?" And we would say, "No, we're not going to Yellowstone." And they would look at us like we were crazy. But we didn't, most people would drive cross country and find places along the way that they want to see because the country holds so much in the way of natural wonder. And that's a great way to see the country. But we were on a very, very different type of trip. And we were interested in the people along the way less than the landmarks and the sightseeing. So it wasn't really till the kind of the last part of the trip that we did any kind of traditional sightseeing and national park visiting. So yeah, the people along the way were our focus.
Yeah. Very cool. And a lot of the book is sort of organized around your discovery of from these people, from ordinary American citizens of all types, all sort of steps in the socioeconomic ladder, about what holds us together. And what are some of the ones that stick out to you, like the reasons that they told you when you asked that question?
So they asked the question of what holds us together.
Yeah.
Well, I heard lots of different answers, although they were generally similar. So people would talk about the Constitution. They would talk about love of freedom. They would talk about community. They would talk about our common humanity. And all of those things are, there's truth in all of them. I think all of them are part of what holds the country together. Um, and there was also this sense of resilience that people would either speak of or allude to when I would ask them, "What are you most concerned about in terms of the country's future?" And I asked everybody that question. Um, and there was a general sense among people that we would get through it. And they often didn't say this is what held us together, but they kind of led me to that conclusion because so many spoke about the resilience of our character and our ability to get through difficult times, to overcome tough challenges. That's part of who we are and what we've always done. And I actually think that's probably the most historically accurate assessment you can make of American history. And I took a lot of hope from that. So when people ask me, are you more optimistic or less, having been on this trip, definitely much more optimistic, and that's one of the big reasons was this sense of resilience that people would express when they're talking about who we are as a country, what holds us together.
Yeah, I love that, and I agree. I feel like the resiliency. It kind of goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, which you write a lot about in the book. Is like part of the American exceptionalism, like the willingness to admit you were wrong, willingness to admit you made a mistake. Okay, maybe we made a huge mistake in persecuting this religious minority. That gives you power because it shows you that like you can overcome it. It gives you some kind of moral power to use it like a Lincoln type phrase. And I feel like that is part of what makes America special.
Yeah, I think there's Americans take a lot of strength in our victories, and we count our victories in many ways more in domestic battles than in foreign ones. And that's a really powerful thing to understand how the country came together around an ideal and struggled and fought for it against people who denied it. And today everybody accepts it. Now, today, not everybody accepts it depending on what topic you're talking about. Those struggles continue. But I agree that I think people take a lot of inspiration and sense of power of what we are capable of doing. And so, whether it was the Civil War or the Civil Rights Movement, we all have this connection to these struggles, and we can all take some inspiration in the fact that they were successful. And so much of today's civil rights movements connect to the previous one. Why? Because you want to build on that success, and you also want to, in people's minds, connect the two. because so much of what was controversial in 1964 is no longer controversial. And it's very likely that so much of what's controversial today will not be controversial in 2064.
Yeah, it's just this growth. Another couple notes that I wrote that really struck me about that question is that there was also a bunch of people who went back to the ideals that you mentioned earlier. Like, and I think you had written the three ideals of this American civic religion. I think it was a phrase or something close to that. It was freedom, democracy, and equality, which I think people really identify with those. Obviously, like we are the only country that's founded upon these incredible ideals. Like we didn't always follow through on them in the right ways, but we keep getting better. And then another one that I think is relevant at this moment in time, maybe even more. Like everyone's talking about this democracy stuff, but I feel like the other one that you mentioned in the book, which is the pioneering, aspirational, entrepreneurial spirit of this place, is also really important because it strikes people in a more daily relevant way, which is like, do I feel like I can participate in the prosperity that's all around me? I think that's the question on America's minds. And you need both. Like, I feel like both of those are required for unity. You need the freedom, democracy, and equality, but you need that pioneering spirit too. And
Yeah,
yeah,
I absolutely agree, and I might kind of fold that into freedom, but you're right. It's the belief in our in the opportunity to be anything you want, to pursue anything you want, um, is of course at the core of American identity, and it's something I certainly heard from people as we travel along, including from the mayor that I mentioned, Sadaf Jaffer in Montgomery Township.
yeah. And I feel like in the last whatever 8 years, let's call it 10 years, the the politicians on both sides of the aisle, I think, have deprioritized the economic side of this American dream story in their rhetoric. It's focusing on different things, and I feel like that's kind of a mistake. And politicians who come forth talking about the American dream, I think, are going to do really well because if you go around like you did and talk to people, that's what people are worried about. Like, am I going to have enough money for retirement? Do my kids have opportunities to advance themselves? Like that's kind of the core American question.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's a lot to be gained in talking about that. And I do think that's part of Trump's appeal, too, is that he has presented himself as a great American success story, the embodiment of the American dream,
Yeah.
someone who has gotten rich. And that is very appealing to people. So, I mean, that is part of our story, part of who we identify with.
Yeah. As you think about this journey and all the people you talk to and all the history that you studied to kind of write the book, what are some of the things you think that we can do in this country to create that more perfect union? To appeal to our better angels, as you reference so many times in the book. Like, what are some of the ideas that you have?
Well, I mentioned I was in South Bend, and another person I spoke to there was an abortion clinic volunteer named April Ladinsky. And she told me about the struggle to build the abortion clinic, not so easy to do in conservative Indiana. It was the only one in the region. And they faced tons of opposition, but they were in the end successful. They opened it, and when it opened, they faced lots of protests. And when I visited, there were protesters picketing essentially out in front of it. And so, but she did something really unusual, and that was she invited some of the people on the other side into her home for a conversation, and she hoped that that would lead to some common ground. And they did come, they had a talk, and they learned that there was no common ground. She was very in favor of a woman's right to choose, and they were very against abortion, and that was not going to change, no matter what it seemed that either side would say. But the moral of the story is they learned something else, and that was that they liked each other, and they kept talking, and they began developing this relationship, and they ended up writing this op-ed for the local paper that said essentially, we have to be able, they described this process that they had been through, and they said we have to be able to prioritize the relationship over the politics. And I think that's something certainly that I carried with me from South Bend, and that when I heard other people along the way talk about how politics was poisoning relationships, and I heard it from others, and I think it's something that probably all of us can identify. All of us probably have friends or family who we have become strained with, or know of others who have become strained with friends or family because of politics. And I think that that lesson, it's really hard to do. It requires, as April Ladinsky described in this piece, it requires listening, requires an open mind, it requires respect, it requires restraint, it requires a certain lack of righteous judgment or willingness to withhold it, as Lincoln was willing to do. And so all of that's hard, but there's a lot to be gained from it. And I do think that there is a lot to be said for all of us challenging ourselves to try to channel some more of that spirit when we find ourselves in situations where relationships start getting strained because of politics, to remember that the relationship is what has to be first, what has to come first.
Absolutely. Yeah. What I'm hoping, I agree completely with that. I feel like we somehow we really lost the idea of civic discourse, and it's like it's gotten kind of crazy. But what I'm hoping is that the attempted assassination of Donald Trump was like the high watermark for the insanity in political dialogue, and we can get back to sort of just debating issues and having reasonable differences and accepting if the majority of the American people, win and pass a law that they feel is the right law at the time, and
I, yeah, I'd like to think that's true. I don't, unfortunately, see a lot of evidence for the idea that we've hit a high water mark, because it's actually shocking to me how quickly the assassination attempt has faded from the news. It's still so recent, and yet it's not in the headlines, and it's not on people's lips. And
true.
I do worry that you'd like to think that that was kind of the worst moment of the year. Hopefully, it will be. But what drove it, kind of the vitriol, or at least the vitriol that's underneath it, we still don't have much information on the killer's attempted killer's motives. But all of the anger, the political anger underneath the surface of so much of American life is still there, and it is going to be there until leaders decide to confront it and to try to, as Lincoln did, inspire our better angels, and to challenge people to rather than feeding on it and living on it, to pushing it aside and to growing and rising above it, and that we're not seeing a lot of that right now in our politics. But I do think that Biden's speech after the assassination, in calling on Americans to do that, was the right tone. I think we need more of that from both candidates. I wish there were more of that at the RNC. I hope there'll be more of that at the DNC. But there's still an awful lot of anger there.
Yeah, there is, and it's going to be a tense summer, no doubt. Well, Frank, this was a fascinating conversation. Could probably talk for a long time about some of these topics, but I'm going to encourage everyone to read the book, and I hope that you go back out. You went out in September, right? You left on September 11th of
Right.
2020, so you could go again and meet some of the same people and see what they have to say. I would actually love to see how people are feeling, 4 years down the road about.
Yeah, I have too. I'm hoping to do some of that. We'll see. But I agree that going back and talking with people 4 years later would be really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and really appreciate the tone of the book and sort of your commitment to America. So thank you for dedicating your time to write that and do that. So.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me, and for your interest and for your commitment to these kinds of civil conversations.
Thanks, man. Look forward to staying in touch.
All right. Likewise.